Hello everyone. So, I'm doing a Metatron video once again. Quick disclaimer though before we start. My YouTube channel is still predominantly a gaming channel, and because most of my content tends to be apolitical in nature, I've come to understand that not only have attracted an audience from all over the world, but I've also attracted people from all over the political spectrum. And this message is for you guys. If you don't like my leftist snowflake takes, that's absolutely fine. Feel free to absolutely skip this video, and I'll see you again in the next one when I make more modding content. For everyone else, let's have some facts and logic. So, for those of you who aren't caught up, Metatron is a history YouTuber who, at least for the past 2 years, has been making increasingly more reactionary content, all the while stubbornly insisting that he's not political, but is only interested in the objective historical truth. In my previous video, I've substantiated that claim by looking at some of his videos and pointing out how they are often very poorly researched, how he cites conservative sources despite claiming objectivity, how bringing current political topics into his videos led him to frame a topic very terribly, and how ultimately he led his audience believe that a screw-up from YouTube regarding his monetization was actually an attempt by big tech to censor him. If you haven't seen this video yet, I do recommend you watch it for more context, but it's worth pointing out that since making this video, Metatron has actually watched it. That's right, one of my commenters shared with me an exchange he had with Metatron on one of his latest videos, in which he brought me up, and Metatron responded, saying that he did watch my video, and that I actually made some good points, which, cool, I'll take it. But in one of his more recent videos, he also said this.
He's a fraud, he won't debate who the ancient Egyptians were, clicks are the purpose of this. Oh no, I'm more than happy to debate it. This is why I'm making a full-on response to all those who have in fact made response videos or debunking videos of my statement. So yes, I will debate it.
Now, I don't want to sound presumptuous, but come on. If he ends up making a response video to all the people who's criticized him, and I'm not included, yeah, I'm gonna have a bit of an ego about that. Now, after my last video, it was my original plan to not look at more of Metatron's content because I did not want to tempt myself into debunking or addressing more of his stuff. But ever since I learned about those two things, that he knows who I am and he's making a response video to someone, I've basically been on the lookout for a video that may or may not include me, that may pop up at any time. And it's in one of those moments that I made the mistake of letting myself watch another one of his videos. This video is called The Truth About Historical Revisionism Once and For All. I didn't really know what to expect when I was watching it, but I did, and damn it, here we are. Now, I want to preempt this a bit. Making this essay was more difficult than the previous one. Not because Metatron's video is particularly well done this time, but rather because I had a really hard time conveying my criticisms from this video alone. At this point in Metatron's channel, a lot of his videos tend to intertwine with each other. Claims will be made in one video with little substantiation, only to be brought back in another video with no substantiation at all. And it ends up falling on anyone trying to make a critique to connect the dots from a rhetoric that is becoming increasingly messier on the part of Metatron. It did not help that in the middle of editing, Metatron released a new video finally talking about his political positions and addressing some criticisms. This video could have easily answered some of the points that I made in my previous video, but instead this new video leaves me with more questions than answers, and it became evident that I could not make this essay without also responding to this video. And so while my video started as a response to his video on historical revisionism, to really make it complete, we'll have to do a whole bunch of other things. So in this video, we'll be discussing the concept of historical revisionism, but also its counterpart, historical negationism. We'll then be going over Metatron's points and see if he's correct on any of them. And finally, we'll be discussing the dangers coming from the right and how Metatron is carefully choosing not to address them, which all ties into his rhetoric in his latest video. I left a link to Metatron's video in the description, so feel free to watch it entirely to make sure that I don't misquote or misrepresent him. But for everyone else, here we go. So, to sum up the video, Metatron makes the claim that there is a push in the media to change how we view history by way of making movies and shows based on history more ethnically diverse. By making historical movies more diverse, and therefore less accurate, Metatron argues that the media is purposefully changing the way society sees history, a phenomenon he simply calls the agenda. or simply woke revisionism. In the first part of the video, Metatron presents his position on the issue, which is that we should be truthful to history no matter what. He argues that changing history for the sake of representation, or dumbing it down so that no one gets upset, is just immoral because at the end of the day, you would just be crafting one big lie that people actually end up buying into. Or to put it another way, history doesn't care about your feelings. In the second part of the video, Metatron argues that while what he is broadly against is woke revisionism, he argues that there are people who unironically defend decisions made by studios by insisting that all history is revisionist history. And then Metatron proceeds to read an article that seemingly addresses the issue. And finally, in the third and last part of the video, Metatron presents an example of historical revisionism done in ancient Rome and how he sees the woke revisionism we have today as potentially more dangerous. So that's the main gist of the video. Before we break it down though, we need to clarify something. Historical revisionism. What does that even mean? The term can actually mean two very different things, and Metatron tends to use the term interchangeably throughout his video, so before we get into it, let's talk about the clear standard definition of historical revisionism. Broadly speaking, historical revisionism is about reinterpreting the historical facts as we know them. So if you look at any given historical events, historical revisionism is about looking at all the facts and evidence we have of said events and see if we can come to different conclusions on the events. Sometimes that can mean questioning the validity of the witnesses involved, or the biases of the historians who recorded the event, and it can also mean finding new evidence that contradicts previous notions we had. If that sounds very confusing, let's just use a clear-cut example, okay? How about the Titanic? Everyone has seen the Titanic movie, right? How the ship split and someone fell and hit his head and then spun to his death? Well, what if I told you that until that movie came out, most people assumed that when the ship sank, it did not actually break in half. While there were a lot of survivors on the Titanic that actually argued that the ship had split in half, there were other survivors who argued it did not. So we had two versions of what happened on the Titanic, and people tended to agree that the ship had not split in half despite very diverging opinions on the matter. So why did we end up choosing one narrative over the other? Well, you see, at the time of the sinking, while there were a lot of witnesses, some were deemed more valuable than others. One predominant witness that argued at the time that the ship had not split in half was a gentleman by the name of Lightholder. He was the ship's second senior officer and the highest ranking crew member to survive the Titanic. And he actually argued so hard that the ship had not split, saying it was impossible, that basically we just took his word for it over that of everybody else, and then we just moved on. If you look at every single depiction of the Titanic before Cameron's movie, they all show the Titanic sinking in a single piece because of it. But then, in the 80s, new evidence was presented when a submarine actually went down to see the wreckage, and the ship was actually in two pieces. The front piece was found fairly intact, and the back half of the ship was found several hundred meters away in a much worse state. So new evidence was presented, and now we understood that the ship had split in two. That still leaves the question though, how was Lightholder convinced that it did not? Well, for the sake of curiosity, let me answer that. Let's say for example that this is the Titanic, okay? If you were seeing it from your angle, and it was like this, and then it split, you would clearly see it. But when Lightholder fell off the ship, he fell off the back end. So his perspective would be like this. And if the ship goes like this and splits in two and comes back, from his angle, especially after the power went out and he's trying to survive in the water, it's very likely that if the ship had split, he would simply not have seen it. So from witness accounts, we had different versions of what happened to the Titanic, but a few decades later, when we found new evidence, we took the time to reevaluate everything we knew about the Titanic, and we came to a new conclusion. That's what historical revisionism is. It's about reevaluating the evidence, putting into question the validity of the witnesses, and the overall goal is to get as close to the historical truth as scientifically possible. That's what historical revisionism is, based on its most commonly associated definition. But in recent years especially, historical revisionism has been associated with something else entirely. So if you have professional historians using historical revisionism to get to the truth, there's also other people, for a wide variety of reasons, that are looking at history to reach a preferred narrative. And to find that preferred narrative, they will often either ignore evidence, or distort it, or purposefully misinterpret it. The most common term associated with that is actually called denialism. And the most common examples of denialism today would be genocide denial. Every time you see someone, for example, arguing that the Holocaust either did not happen or wasn't as bad as is commonly known, this person is engaging in denialism. But denialism is specifically about arguing that an event did not happen. When we're talking about reaching a very different narrative, the broader term is actually historical negationism. So for the rest of that video, I will actually be referring to historical revisionism in its standard form, and I will be talking about historical negationism for what Metatron is actually talking about in the video. Now that we've established this, let's finally head into it. So I've already summed up the video, but now let's hear it from the man himself.
In this video, we'll see how real historical facts have been changed, doctored, banned, or altered in the past. Whether it be the exaggerated numbers of battle reports for patriotic and propaganda reasons, done by several medieval rulers, the complete destruction of anything that goes against a carefully fabricated lie, such as the Aztecs' complete rewriting of their own history, or Imperial Japan trying to hide Unit 731, we'll also see how real historical facts are being changed in the present. How historical truth is under a systematic extensive attack fueled by corporate money, which is permeating both the educational and edutainment infrastructure, particularly in Western society within the Anglosphere. It's an attack to our collective memory. We'll talk about how power has been given to those who have demonstrated incompetence in handling even the most basic facts and have zero interest in applying any sort of guard against selective bias. How there is no my truth or her truth, but only one absolute truth. And I say this in defense of evidence-based and reliably sourced factual reality.
So there is a lot there. Let's break it down. Right off the bat, you will notice that Metatron is not talking about historical revisionism in its standard definition, even once in this entire intro. He's actually talking about examples of historical negationism. But then we actually move on to what the video actually is about. You see these examples of the Mayans or the Japanese denying their war crimes, or feudal lords exaggerating their victories. While in a historical video, these things could be interesting to look at, in the context of this specific video, it's a veil. It's just a quick mention on the side for Metatron so that when he starts spewing more conservative talking points, he can go back and be like, whoa, 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 whoa. You can't say I'm right-wing. I talked about those other examples too. I'm just interested in the objective truth. This is something, by the way, that Metatron does all the time. Quick mention to the side of something else, say, yeah, that's bad too, before conveniently always cover history from a conservative perspective. So the real video is about this issue, how history today is being systematically attacked by corporations, shown here as an example is Netflix, and they are, quote, permeating the education and edutainment infrastructure. And the next quote is even weirder.
Particularly in Western society within the Anglosphere.
This is a very carefully crafted sentence, and we will come back to it later in the video. But these claims are only followed by another, rather odd one.
It's an attack to our collective memory.
But that's it, really. Forget every other mention of historical negationism he's talked about. This video is about woke Hollywood and how he doesn't like it. That's the argument he's making, so now let's see some examples.
Modern and politically motivated historical revisionism, however, which is the only form of historical revisionism we are complaining about, is a completely different beast, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with the methodology used in professional and academic discourse. But does the end justify the means? Inclusivity, representation. Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII of England? The end does not justify the means. This is not true representation, because it's based on a lie.
Okay, so right off the bat, we have a bit of a problem. The argument being made is that woke revisionism is permeating the education and edutainment infrastructure, and that the act of compromising history for the sake of diversity is, quote, an attack to our collective memory. This last part is not something that Metatron ever substantiates further in his video, which is problematic because that's what he rests his entire argument on. If he did not perceive changes made in historical depictions to affect how we remember history, he would not be making a video at all. That said, we have the argument, and now we have examples of what Metatron considers woke revisionism. But before we even get into the examples, we now have to ask, is the act of compromising history in the media an attack on collective memory? What even is a collective memory? Well, according to Wikipedia, collective memory refers to the shared pool of memories, knowledge, and information of a social group that is significantly associated with a group's identity. If that sounds vague, that's because it is. A collective memory can refer to anything related to the past, so long as the idea is vaguely shared within a group. The problem, though, is that unlike science, a collective memory can be socially constructed, and as such can form in a variety of ways. Schools can implement a collective memory, culture can implement collective memories. Oral tradition is a form of collective memory, one which can drastically change the details of history from one generation to the next. This also means that a single event can be interpreted wildly differently by different groups. As such, collective memories, while an interesting psychological and sociological concept, is not a reliable way of looking at history at all, which is also why the Wikipedia page makes a clear distinction with actual history, which is about providing a comprehensive, accurate, and unbiased portrayal of past events. All of this to say, if Metatron is coming from the position that there is only one objective truth, then he must also acknowledge that collective memories are not the objective truth. Defending the truth under the guise of protecting our collective memory is oxymoronic, especially when you consider that there is no monolith on collective memories. People have very different ideas of what history is in the first place, and these notions can be influenced by just about anything, including the media. But where does that leave the media exactly? If we acknowledge that people's views and understanding can be influenced by many things, should movies be held accountable for what people retain from them? As an example, take Braveheart. Did Braveheart's depiction of history influence a collective memory? Well, if you have people watching the movie and believing afterwards that Scottish people in the Middle Ages wore kilts and blue paint, then yes, you can make the argument that the movie influenced people's perspective on history. But is Braveheart an attack on history itself? If someone watches this movie, are they barred from learning the real history in any other way? Does all the evidence we have of the historical event simply vanish because of this movie? And is this movie replacing actual academia? The answer is obviously no. My point is, the question isn't really whether movies today attack our collective memories when they compromise history, it's whether that matters at all. Movies, after all, are art, and art is subjective. And while it's easy to blame movies for the misconceptions people retain from them, movies do not stand in the way of actual history, which everyone is free to access and research if they wish. So I don't think criticizing the media today for attacking our collective memory is a valid point, especially when this point is only ever made when talking about the accuracy of skin color. This speaks less to a concern for historical accuracy, and more to a concern for skin color. But even accepting this, that movie can influence people's views even if they don't have the academic authority to do so. Is it possible for movies to nonetheless maliciously try to mislead people on purpose? The answer is yes, but to suggest the movie is doing so on purpose, you would have to indicate that there was intent on the part of the people involved in the movie. And this brings us back to what historical negationism actually is. It's not just the act of falsifying and distorting history, it's doing so with the goal of reaching a preferred narrative. So, are any of the examples brought up by Metatron actual historical figures? Well, yes, some of them. Would it be inaccurate to say that those people were black historically? Also yes. But were those castings done with the intent of teaching something wrong about history, or were they simply creative choices in a context where historical accuracy was not deemed important? To suggest any of these examples are acts of historical negationism, you must prove the intent. You would have to prove that the people involved in those castings either genuinely believed or wanted to make people believe that those historical figures were black. Any statement in which the producers defend the castings on historical grounds would be evidence of that. Any statement in which they defend the casting on artistic grounds would be evidence of a creative decision. And in the case of Metatron, to prove that there is a broader agenda by large media corporations to change the way we remember history, you would also need to prove this intent, or he wouldn't need enough examples that fit the criteria to indicate a clear pattern. So looking back at Metatron's arguments, can any of these examples be considered historical negationism at all, or were they all simply creative decisions? And are any of these examples, quote, permeating the education and edutainment infrastructure? By education, I'm thinking this to mean schools, colleges, anytime one of these examples would be shown in academia as part of a curriculum. And by edutainment, I can only think of documentaries. So this would leave out several formats, such as fiction, since that implies everything is made up, it has nothing to do with the actual argument. And historical fiction, by design, does not aim for historical accuracy. Theater plays are also not documentaries, let alone works of academia, whether they are played on a stage or on camera. So knowing all of this, where does that leave us? Well, crossing out fictional characters, we have to remove Sir Lancelot from Once Upon a Time, Heimdall from the Thor movies, Freya Tuck of Robin Hood, Bedivere from King Arthur, Achilles and Zeus from BBC's Troy, and Guinevere from the show Merlin. Crossing out historical fiction, we remove Anne Boleyn from The Tudors, Margaret of Anjou from The Hollowed Crown, and Karl from Marshal of Finland. And finally, by removing theater plays, we are removing Julius Caesar, played here by football coach Eddie George during the Shakespeare Festival in Nashville, and Joan of Arc for another theater play. Now, I'm sure a lot of you right now are being very critical of how easily I cast aside these examples, but I'll just ask you again, are any of these examples works of academia? Are any of these shown in schools? Were any of the people involved actively making the argument that these characters were black, or were they simply making a creative decision by being inclusive? You might argue instead that being historically inaccurate is wrong regardless of where it comes from, to which I would simply argue that movies can, and have always done, whatever they want, and that if you're not happy with this one specific type of inaccuracy, then you need to explain why. Seriously though, this is an argument I've made in all of my past 3 essays, and I have yet to hear a good counter-argument. If a movie's goal is to take an historical event and do whatever they want with it, why is this always given a free pass, except when it comes to skin color? In truth, there are only so many ways you can try and rationalize a bias here, and Metatron himself is a good example of that. Sure, a channel where you separate the true from the false in historical depictions can be both fun and educational, which is why I was a fan of his content in the first place. But over the course of his YouTube career, he went from simply talking about those things to now saying that inclusivity specifically isn't just inaccurate, it's dangerous. It's not just productions compromising something they did not deem important for the sake of being inclusive, because now it's straight up historical negationism. It's a purposeful attempt by the media to change how society views history. Metatron went from not liking diversity in historical movies to promoting a conspiracy theory. And again, he will never make those arguments for any other type of inaccuracy, only skin color. But at the end of the day, you have to look at the instances of inclusivity for what they actually are. If none of those examples were documentaries or works of academia, then suggesting they are instances of historical negationism is simply ridiculous. Now you might say something like, okay, maybe they did not intend to do historical negationism on purpose, but they still run the risk of people believing what they saw was true. There may not be intent, but the outcome leads to negationism. And to this, I would dare say, short of a documentary, that's the viewer's problem. Now that might be very arrogant, but just hear me out here. Because the problem is, whether you're talking about documentaries or movies that made a lot of effort to be accurate, or very little effort to be accurate, at the end of the day, you cannot control what people will take at face value. You simply can't. I like to take the example of 300, because sure, all us history buffs, we know 300 is completely exaggerated, we know they didn't fight in their underwear, and we know it wasn't the point to be historical either when Zack Snyder made that movie. But what if somewhere, someone watches 300 and now they're going off about their lives thinking that the Spartans fought half naked? Whose fault is that? Is that the producers' fault? Or is that the audience's fault? Could we argue that by influencing the way someone views the Spartans now, Zack Snyder did some historical revisionism? To me, that all sounds like a very slippery slope of which there is no logic to get out of. And that's my main point here. None of these examples show an explicit intent, and holding them responsible when movies distort reality all the time to begin with is not reasonable, it's just biased. And that's because the people making that argument would never hold every single movie to that same critical standard. But we're not done though. There are 2 more examples, Robert de Beaumont and the infamous Cleopatra from Netflix. Robert de Beaumont comes from the docudrama series Europe's Last Warrior Kings. Now this example is a bit more complicated, and that's because of the format itself, that of docudrama. Docudrama is a subgenre of documentary where essentially the overall narrative and story is meant to be accurate and factual, but the actual depiction using actors is dramatized. In the context of this documentary, that means the history itself aimed to be accurate, but they weren't too concerned about who they cast to play the historical figures themselves. So while you could make an argument that being purposefully inaccurate in a docudrama can mislead the audience in a way we don't expect from documentaries, for the broader point of Metatron's video, there is no evidence that anyone involved genuinely believed Robert de Beaumont to be black, nor have I seen any evidence that this series has been implemented in any curriculums. So, irresponsible casting? Sure. Historical negationism? Not really. And that leaves us with the documentary whose name cannot be spoken. Okay, so to be clear, I might be a leftist, but I'm not a complete idiot. All the evidence we have right now points to Cleopatra being of Greek descent, likely white, whatever that means in today's society compared to what it meant back then. Is this example historical negationism? I would argue it was. Unlike Europe's Last Warrior Kings, that just casted a black person in the drama part and didn't really give it a second thought, in Netflix Cleopatra, they didn't just cast a black Cleopatra. They presented arguments for why she would be black without the actual evidence to back it up. And even the director of the series actually came out arguing that making Cleopatra black was a clear intent at challenging the narrative and evidence we currently have. So, for all intents and purposes, making Cleopatra black was a bit of an attempt at making historical negationism. However, and this is where it gets more important, in my opinion, this does not support Metatron's argument of an agenda. And that has a lot to do with how we view documentaries in the first place. We expect them to convey factual information, and therefore we hold them to a higher standard. Even people who argue for like historical accuracy, they will look at movies and think, okay, like this can take a few creative liberties, but if we're actually making a documentary, nothing less than perfectly factual information will do. And to be clear, I understand why that is. Documentaries are not fiction, as I said. They are meant to convey factual information. That's what we expect from documentaries, and as such, we tend to put a lot of trust in them. The problem, though, begins with the concept of responsibility. The argument is that documentaries have a responsibility to share accurate information. But that's not a legal argument, it's a moral one, and that's where people tend to get confused. So, as a side example, how do you ensure that what is taught in schools is accurate? Well, the curriculum is typically peer-reviewed by specialists and educators to ensure it is both accurate and can be understood by the target audience, from young children to teenagers. It is also constantly updated based on a newer understanding of the information itself, as well as the new techniques found in teaching. The teachers themselves also have to go to university to get the qualifications, ensuring teachers are fully trained for the job. So when a teacher gives information to a student, there's a big process behind it to make sure that the information is accurate and the teacher is trained. But when it comes to documentaries, although we hold them to a similar standard as public education, documentaries, legally speaking, they're not peer-reviewed, there's no regulations for them, meaning that a documentary could be consulting experts, it could be showing the information in the professional manner that you would expect documentaries to do, and they can still be completely full of shit on purpose. So while I do think it is absolutely fair to hold documentaries to a higher standard, at the end of the day we have to remember that documentaries, most of them are private productions and have completely free reign over what they say. And most importantly, they are not funded by the public, nor do they align with public education. Cleopatra is not a documentary shown in schools. It's just an Afrocentrist documentary that Netflix in this case happened to produce. And speaking of Netflix, this is where intent comes into play again. Because you can make an argument for Cleopatra being an attempt at historical negationism, but to suggest that Netflix has an agenda to do that with all of their documentaries, to brainwash society into remembering history differently, that's a completely different argument, and one that is still unsubstantiated. Which is why Metatron does not show any sources from Netflix itself, and it's also why Cleopatra stands out in this regard when all other examples that could possibly prove his point aren't even similar. They're not documentaries themselves. And I, for one, would rather go with the much more reasonable explanation that has actually been documented, and it's that Netflix, like all big media corporations, often engages in rainbow capitalism and supports Project of Color for brownie points and better PR. Netflix only cares about its bottom line, that's all it is. And ultimately, when it comes to Cleopatra, it will not be the first, nor will it be the last documentary to mislead its audience on purpose. In recent years, actually, there's been many documentaries coming from the right. During the pandemic, there was the documentary series called Plandemic that was filled with misinformation, despite having that slick aesthetic. And more recently, there's the documentary by Matt Walsh called What is a Woman, which the scientific and medical communities have already ripped into for being full of misinformation. Essentially, despite the high standard and trust we have for documentaries, a lot of them simply won't tell us the truth. They will lie on purpose. And again, while I agree you can hold them responsible instead of the audience, at the end of the day, Cleopatra is not shown in schools anywhere. Let me know when that happens, and I will back down from everything and join you in protest. But as far as I'm concerned, the only reasons this documentary made such a fuss is because it was produced by a bigger company like Netflix, and because it was done by black people. And again, just so we're clear, I'm not saying any of this is okay. What I am saying though, is that using this as an example that the agenda is real, that there is an agenda to brainwash society through diversity, to make us change the way we remember our history, it's a very ridiculous proposition, and unsurprisingly, it's just a right-wing talking point. So there we have it. Of all examples brought by Metatron, only one instance can constitute an attempt at historical negationism, but coming from a private company that is not associated with public education in any way, in a genre that has no regulations, Metatron's claim of an agenda in the media has yet to be substantiated. Now Metatron is actually going to talk about woke revisionism in academia. And for that, Metatron will now proceed to read an article written by an historian on historical revisionism. He did not leave a link to the article in his video description, but I did, so feel free to check it out and see for yourself. But let us now leave Metatron to introduce the article himself.
Unfortunately, this whole idea that many truths exist and should all be respected is starting to take foot, even within academia. And talking about academia, today I ran into this article on National Endowment for the Humanities. All history is revisionist history. Now, I suspect that this is the article that everyone who says, aha, but all history is revisionist history, so you shouldn't complain, is using as a basis. Because they're literally repeating the words written on this article, ad verbatim. Now, to be transparent, I don't know anything about the author of this article. I don't know anything about his political position, his allegiances, and maybe it's better that way. Because what we're going to do now, we're going to read a few passages from this article. And since I don't know anything, I can't have any preconceived idea or bias. I'm just going to judge this article on the basis of what's written on it. And believe me, I've already found quite a few massive red flags. But I am giving the professor the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he's not using this to defend woke revisionism. And perhaps all the rest of his publications are masterworks. I don't know. I'm just reviewing this one article. Let's go.
Okay, so before we even get into the article, let's pay attention to how Metatron presents it. Metatron is making the argument that there are people out there unironically defending woke revisionism on the idea that all history is revisionist history. And then he points to the article, suggesting that the people making those arguments are probably referring to it as well, because a lot of what they say seems to echo in this article. But there's an issue here, and it's that neither point is actually proven. If there are people out there unironically defending woke revisionism on that premise, Metatron does not show us a single comment, video clip, nothing. And even assuming these people exist, there is no evidence that they're using this article either. As said by Metatron himself, he just found it that day, I'm guessing either in the middle of recording or just before that. So the idea that Metatron is going in without any preconceived ideas or bias, as he put it, is absurd. But most importantly, as I've said before, historical revisionism has a standard definition used by historians, but it can also be confused with historical negationism. And Metatron literally says that he doesn't know which definition the historian is referring to in the article.
But I am giving the professor the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he's not using this to defend woke revisionism.
So does Metatron take the time to actually find that out? Or does he proceed assuming the article defends woke revisionism regardless? Well, again, the article is in the description, so feel free to check it out yourself, but in my opinion, Metatron is misunderstanding the article completely. The article is solely about historical revisionism in its standard definition. It never mentions wokeness, it never mentions the entertainment industry, and it never even mentions historical accuracy in movies. The article is all about revisionism, how it works, how historians use it, and how it's embedded in all of our history, and why that's important to acknowledge. But Metatron, while he could understand all of that, he's nonetheless coming in expecting arguments that defend woke revisionism, and he's prepared to argue against that. So how could that possibly go?
The professor says, mere facts don't have meaning. They must be given that meaning by human beings, and those human beings very well may disagree among themselves about their meaning. He then proceeds to present his eloquent and well-articulated defense of historical revisionism, and then we reach a paradox. At the end of the article, after having presented his positions, he says, we should celebrate as well as accept that fact. You said that mere facts have no meanings unless we humans give a meaning to them, and that human beings may very well disagree. So according to what you said at the beginning of the article, why should I accept and celebrate the facts you presented?
That's what happens when you just skip a whole bunch of paragraphs and try and connect two different lines together. So let's look at the article and find the full quote. Many people also resist accepting the simple truth that historians, whom they consider experts, disagree about the facts and what to make of them. To be sure, everyone can agree that the Declaration of Independence was approved on July 2nd, 1776, and was adopted 2 days later. Those are the facts, but what do they mean? That independence was a summer event? that it came suddenly, that it capped at least 11 years of increasing turmoil, that it inaugurated 5 years of brutal warfare, and so on. Mere facts don't have meaning. They must be given that meaning by human beings. Again, feel free to read it yourself, link in the description, but the gist of this paragraph basically is that facts in of themselves don't tell a story. But more specifically, it's about historical facts. Whether an historical event can be interpreted as the beginning of something, or the end of something, or a factor in a bigger story, it's something that, although we know the facts themselves, they can be interpreted to mean different things. The reason you wouldn't understand that from watching Metatron's video is because all he's really doing is isolating a single sentence about how historical facts have no meaning, and he's trying to connect it to a line way further down at the end. But even that single line, what if we just take the full line behind it for more context? What does it say? Revisionist history ensures the unending renewal of knowledge of what came before our own days on Earth. We should celebrate as well as accept that fact.
So according to what you said at the beginning of the article, why should I accept and celebrate the facts you presented?
Excuse me, sir? How can you say we can celebrate a fact if facts have no meaning? Checkmate, Professor! You might be the co-founder of the National History Center of the American Historical Association, but I just debunked you after 5 minutes of reading. So the professor wasn't even talking about historical facts anymore. He was talking broadly about historical revisionism. And the freedom we have to use historical revisionism is the fact that should be celebrated. By singling out two sentences from two completely different parts of the article, Metatron is trying to create a paradox here, but it's a really bad point that the article doesn't even make. And here again, because Metatron is not bothering to read the full thing, he has a fundamental misunderstanding of what the article is saying.
But if no subject is immune from reconsideration, what about the widespread conviction that history can and should be objective? In the sense of being an accurate and full account of what actually occurred. It's likely to surprise most people that today's historians believe that it can't be. On what grounds do they believe that? The first reason, both existential and epistemological, grows from the impossibility of knowing all that has happened in the past. Personally, this feels like an elaborate, weak defense for historical revisionism. I agree with the fundamental idea that yes, we can't know everything and therefore we need to constantly reshape and remodel the things we know. But that does not mean that history and historical research cannot try to be objective or as objective as possible. So the simple fact that you can't know everything doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to know as much as possible.
The professor here is not saying that because we can't know everything we should not bother. He's simply pointing out the fact that we can't know everything. To his credit, Metatron understands this, but he proceeds to make the argument that we should nonetheless try and get as close to the truth as possible, as if the article doesn't make that exact same point just a few lines later. Yet, this should be no cause for despair. Each new contribution to deeper and fuller understanding of anything ought to be seen as closing in on, even if it can never reach, a meeting point at which historians will agree that all that can be said about the subject has been said, so that an enduring consensus as to what probably occurred and why it did so is reached. With robust commitment to that goal, even without hope of ever fully reaching it, historians press on in confidence that, as existing evidence is re-evaluated, new evidence discovered, and new minds put to work on a subject, the gap between what is known and what remains to be understood narrows bit by bit. If there is one thing you should remember from this video about historical revisionism, it really should be this part, and it's that we can never recover all of history in its entirety. The entire science of historiography is based on that premise, because it's that premise that allows us to find new evidence and come to new interpretations. So say for the sake of argument that a history YouTuber decides to make a video on any given topic, say homosexuality in ancient Greece, and names their video "The Truth About LGBTQ+ in Ancient Greece Once and for All." One could argue that this is just a clickbait title, but for people who don't know any better and take these videos at face value, they could easily assume that everything there is to know about the topic is going to be covered in that one video, and one can also assume from there that there will never be any attempts at reinterpreting the current evidence we have, nor will there ever be new evidence that can question the conclusion that this video is reaching. So for someone who understood right here that history can never be fully recovered, to decide to name his videos as if he has the final say on a given topic is, at best, arrogant, and at worst it's hypocritical. Just saying. But anyway, to go back to the article again, the criticism that Metatron has that the professor's description of historical revisionism is elaborate but weak is only a point that makes sense if you don't assume that the professor ends up making the same argument that Metatron is making. The two actually agree with each other, but Metatron can't even notice because he's not even taking the time to read the article properly. Something that sadly becomes recurrent.
Then the professor goes on to talking about the storming of the Bastille in Paris, July 14th, 1789. Yes, we have some witness accounts, but we can't know for sure if what they're remembering is right, because there is some bias in selective memory. You might have the perspective of someone from outside the Bastille, someone inside the Bastille, and at the end of this he says, the result is that what historians know of anything in the past is only a part of what occurred, what's witnessed and what's reported. This is really strange because it makes it sound like all historians do is review verbal reports or written records. But that's not how you do history. You need to overlap these reports with archaeology, the reviewing of the material goods, literary evidence, cultural evidence, statuary, iconography, stelae. That's how you pinpoint three-dimensionally any event in the past.
Once again, Metatron is making an argument without even reading the full quote. Does the professor here actually argue that the only thing they evaluate is witness accounts? In addition to being beyond re-experiencing, no past event, whether as small in scale as an auto accident or as vast as a revolution, can be recorded in its entirety while taking place or understood in its entirety afterward. Only some, never all, evidence of an event, say reports of witnesses, physical remains, and films and sound recordings, remains behind, does not deteriorate, or isn't purposefully destroyed, and what does remain is a result of such factors as its collector's partialities, their speed and intent in saving it, their point of view when reporting it, and sheer accident. So just so we're clear, physical evidence, by definition, includes material goods and archaeology. Now the professor does bring up audio and video recordings, but to suggest he would not also include writings in there would be extremely disingenuous. And again, just think about that. The lines were literally in the same article that Metatron is criticizing for lacking nuance. I am positive by now that the historian is actually much more used and capable of reading everything in an entirety, unlike Metatron.
Where enforced orthodoxy exists, there lies totalitarianism. I would agree with that, but I would also add the same applies to cancel culture and removal of freedom of speech. Same totalitarianism.
On a side note, this is what I mean when I say the whole video is about right-wing nonsense. It is only from the political right that we hear whining about cancel culture and freedom of speech, and it's all very silly. Why is it silly? Well, cancel culture isn't totalitarianism. If someone disagrees with Metatron online and calls him a racist, the police isn't barging in and putting a black bag on his face, and he's right here sharing his opinions to his well over 800,000 subscribers. How is his freedom of speech being taken away when someone disagrees? On the other hand, if historians were forced to adapt a single narrative and were prohibited from looking at the evidence and coming to new interpretations, that would be, by definition, removing their freedom of speech. That would be totalitarianism. So the idea that cancel culture is on the same level is a really stupid idea. Oh my god, we're only 2/3 of the way through the video. We gotta keep going.
And here is the part I take most issue with. A democratic culture in which different views and different truths are allowed to coexist and share billing in the public forum of thought ought also to be seen as a glorious storehouse of ideas. There is absolutely nothing glorious about supporting and pushing many different truths. Fundamental truth is not dialectical. The sun is either 92% hydrogen or is not. You're either here or you are not. The ancient Romans existed or they didn't. Both contrasting statements cannot be true at the same time because they are mutually exclusive. It's not a matter of, well, the Roman Empire exists and is my truth, and the Roman Empire not exists and is her truth. Truth isn't an opinion.
And finally, with this part here, we reach the point that Metatron is trying to make, but it just doesn't work. And it really comes down to the two main points that you're supposed to retain from the article. The article is talking about historical revisionism in its standard form, not negationism. And the entire article is about how this standard historical revisionism is important and essentially embedded in all the history as we know it. But those points end up completely ignored by Metatron because he's coming in looking for arguments that support woke revisionism, whether the article makes those arguments or not. Metatron essentially comes to the conclusion that different truths cannot exist at the same time, but that in the world of the historian, as he describes it, everything is just valid, but the historian never actually makes that argument. In fact, here's a quote that we already read, by the way, where the professor describes how historians deal with conflicting evidence and diverging narratives. Each new contribution to deeper and fuller understanding of anything ought to be seen as closing in on, even if it can never reach, a meeting point at which historians will agree that all that can be said about the subject has been said, so that an enduring consensus as to what probably occurred and why it did so is reached. So what he is saying is that in the absence of the absolute truth, historians will nonetheless try and reach a consensus on what most likely happened. That doesn't mean all opinions are valid. If we take the example of the Roman Empire, for example, the consensus on the Roman Empire having existed has been reached by historians a very long time ago. What the professor would probably say in this context, based on what he wrote in the article, is that while we do agree that the Roman Empire existed, there would be a lot of things within the Roman Empire that are still very much up for debate. So the truths in quotes that the professor is talking about here isn't about just having like random feelings and they're all valid. The truths in quotes is about the different evidence we might have on an historical event that might actually end up contradicting each other. So take back the example of the Titanic that I brought at the beginning. In the absence of physical evidence, we had different witnessing accounts. We had some people who argued the ship did not break, and we had some people who argued it did. We had different truths. And the glorious storehouse of ideas that the professor is describing here isn't the idea that we can just like argue infinitely about things we just made up. He's only talking about the freedom we have in a society to debate these different versions of historical events without having a version forced on people. In this context, if someone today argued that the ship did not split, I don't think the professor would censor them, but he would look at the evidence and he would come to a consensus with historians that the opinion is wrong and that the ship did break in half. And he would do that in a free society where debating these things is allowed. And to be clear, I don't think Metatron would disagree with that if he took the time to read it, but it comes back to the core issue that we have, and it's that the article and Metatron are talking about two completely different things. But Metatron was so eager to find an example of the woke mob infiltrating academia that he ended up stumbling on that article and proceeded to argue against it based on the conclusion that he was trying to reach. Just so we're clear, let's say we take Metatron's premise at face value here, that there are people who defend woke revisionism literally using that article as an example. Well, these people are wrong too. Metatron, just like them, would be misinterpreting the article based on their preferred narrative. But the reality is, you can debunk both of them if you just read the article with its intended purpose. It's not about negationism, it's about revisionism. Pure and simple. So if Metatron was trying to get to the truth here of woke revisionism, he did a pretty bad job, to put it lightly. This was his one piece of evidence for the woke mob infiltrating academia, and he could not have possibly misinterpreted it more if he tried. Unfortunately, that's what happens when you argue right-wing talking points. When all your narrative is based on nothing but a moral panic, you will never find systemic, clear evidence of it happening. You may be lucky to find a small anecdote somewhere, but the entire narrative is ridiculous. It's a lie. And guess what, guys? We did not even finish his video, so let's finish this. What else has he got?
I would like to now introduce briefly the concept of damnatio memoriae, which is a modern term in Latin to describe something that the ancient Romans absolutely did, particularly during the imperial period.
Metatron is stepping back from woke revisionism to instead talk about an actual example of historical negationism from the past, damnatio memoriae. Sorry for butchering it. The term means condemnation of memory, and was the practice in ancient times, specifically in Rome, of one emperor erasing, destroying, or changing the history of the previous emperor. And they did so by destroying texts, destroying statues and other artifacts, as well as appropriate that history for themselves. They would also make heavy use of censorship, and in some cases, even mentioning the name of someone being erased could be punishable by death. That's the gist of it. Again, feel free to watch Metatron's video for the full thing, but he does end up making a point.
Even though damnatio memoriae was a rather flamboyant and physical way of altering or doctoring memories, in a way I believe it was less dangerous than what's happening today. When a book is doctored, people don't even know that there was a change in the first place. And when they read, they don't know that the words they're reading don't actually belong to the original author. You cannot fight an enemy you can't see. Also, when it comes to mass psychology, the key to establish a false memory is its significance to the group. Hence, Cleopatra was the right pick, not the Kandake. In my opinion, if we allow the values of the present to manipulate the past, we risk to enter a circle of doom projected to our immediate future, as each successive present will then reshape the past according to their values, which, make no mistake, will change.
Let me get this straight. You could be living under an autocrat. You could have no freedom of speech. You could live under a state that can decide at any time to erase parts of its own history, and refusing to comply with these new policies could result in you getting executed. And in a way, the woke revisionism we see today is more dangerous. Well, to add a bit of nuance to this argument, let's think about what we have today and how it differs from the condemnation of memory that the Romans would employ, okay? If a publishing house today openly declares that they're going to doctor some of their books, okay? A private publishing company publicly declaring that they're going to doctor some of their books is not the same as a state doing it by force. Also, just because they're releasing a new version doesn't mean that they are erasing the versions from before. Those are still accessible. Also, you still have the freedom of speech to criticize them when they're doing it, and no one who is doing any kind of criticism is getting the death penalty. And also, these books are not part of a curriculum either. And obviously, you could say the same thing about something like Cleopatra. A private documentary from a private company is not the same as the state trying to erase an entire chunk of history. You can still criticize Cleopatra without getting the electric chair, and the documentary is not part of a curriculum either. The notion that you could even compare the two examples together is so ridiculous, it is frustrating to even address. And it's always coming from the conservatives. They're always the ones complaining about censorship with their massive channels, unsurprisingly. And they're always saying dumb shit like, oh, I'm being censored because I can't speak the truth about Cleopatra. This is literally 1984. In fact, even in this very video at the beginning, Metatron practically quotes the damn book.
All the way to the damnatio memoriae used by Roman authorities. If you change the past, you control the present.
But Metatron, what the Romans did, that's the real 1984. To suggest that what we have today is quite possibly more dangerous than what they had, I'm sorry, it's probably the dumbest thing you've ever said. But I guess me saying that cancels you now, right?
That's your truth, and this is my truth, and you need to respect it. In fact, if you keep talking, you're racist, homophobic, blah blah blah, I will cancel you. That is totalitarianism.
Okay, you know what? I am so tired of hearing that same talking point as if like every time they say something and someone disagrees, they're cancelled or some shit. So let's actually put that to the test. Hey Metatron, are you watching? Good. Look straight into my eyes, okay? You made a very bad video. You had very silly arguments and you failed to substantiate them properly. Therefore, I disagree with everything you said and I'm canceling you. You are no longer allowed to speak freely because I said so. Okay, well, I've said it now, so let me know when the totalitarianism comes into effect. If, hypothetically, you're not impacted in the slightest by what I just said, as I suspect will be the case, then I hope that we can at least agree on something. And it's that totalitarianism does not work the way you just suggested it does. Come on, man! This is ridiculous and you know it. This is a very silly argument to finish an already bad video. Now that we've gone over Metatron's very poor examples of woke revisionism, it's time we talk about Metatron himself, and how his rhetoric is getting even worse than before. You see, despite Metatron's content getting more reactionary over the past few years, Metatron has stubbornly insisted that it has very little to do with politics. He will argue that bad history is bad no matter what side of the political line it comes from, and that he's only interested in the objective truth. And to be clear, I agree with him on principle. Historical negationism is bad. Denying or twisting history in the context of educating a population is morally reprehensible. But imagine for a second that there are actual attempts in the world right now to change the way history is taught to fit a political agenda. And imagine that you are yourself a history YouTuber trying to raise awareness of that. Wouldn't you want to call it out regardless of where it comes from? The thing is, these examples exist, and Metatron knows it. He's just being very careful not to cover them. Here's a few examples. How about Florida stripping down its African American studies from the curriculum? This is a quote from the New York Times. After heavy criticism from Governor Ron DeSantis, the College Board released on Wednesday an official curriculum for its new Advanced Placement course in African American Studies, stripped of much of the subject matter that had angered the governor and other conservatives. The College Board purged the names of many black writers and scholars associated with critical race theory, the queer experience, and black feminism. It ushered out some politically fraught topics like Black Lives Matter from the formal curriculum. And it added something new. Black conservatism is now offered as an idea for a research project. From pen.org, the 2022 school year has been marked to date by an escalation of book bans and censorship in classrooms and school libraries across the United States. These efforts to chill free speech are part of an ongoing nationwide Ed Scare, a campaign to foment anxiety and anger with the goal of suppressing free expression in public education. As book bans escalate, coupled with the proliferation of legislative efforts to restrict teaching about topics such as race, gender, American history, LGBTQ+ identities, the freedom to read, learn, and think continues to be undermined for students. From NBC News, Florida public schools will now teach students that some black people benefited from slavery because it taught them useful skills, part of a new African American history standards approved Wednesday that were blasted by a state teachers union as a step backward. Other language that has drawn the ire of some educators and education advocates includes teaching about how black people were also perpetrators of violence during race massacres. That's all very recent, isn't it? It's not like the US have been doing that for a while though, right? Well, how about the United Daughters of the Confederacy, a group of women that shaped education in the southern states after the Civil War, and most of it centers around the Lost Cause myth. It changed things about the Civil War, made it seem like a war of aggression from the North instead of a war to preserve slavery. And even to this day, they are people who have been influenced by this education, who just walk around saying that the Civil War was over states' rights. I assure you, if Metatron was really interested in talking about negationism in schools, it would be very easy for him to find all of those things with a single Google search. In fact, he doesn't even need to use Google because he already knows about all of those things. How do I know? Because that commenter I told you about at the beginning, the one who shared the comment with Metatron, he listed all of these examples I just gave you to Metatron, and Metatron actually responded to those events. Here's what he says. I do admit I have a tendency on focusing more on woke, or shall we say extreme left incorrect propaganda, rather than extreme right incorrect propaganda. But keep in mind I have said multiple times on my videos that white supremacy is wrong, that I support equality, and we shouldn't judge or treat people differently because of their skin. I do fight these positions too. Now here is why I usually focus more on the woke. It's not because I think extreme left-wing lies are worse than extreme right-wing lies. All lies are bad. It's because the woke are literally everywhere these days. History films, movies, video games, comics, documentaries, streaming services, it's always in my face. On the other hand, since I've never been to an alt-right forum, those sort of extreme positions are not constantly down my throat. That's the reason why I mostly focus on woke stuff. I have nothing against left, right, center, you can be whatever you want, you'll always be welcome here. As for banning books in America, you are going a bit out of my scope of expertise, to be honest. Should history be taught the way it was? Sure, that's what I always say. So of course it applies to anyone who tries to change it in a teaching context. It doesn't matter if it's right, left, or center, if they want to censor historical info, I'm against it. As for the rest of your video titles, you are entering full-on politics, specifically American politics. On this channel, I don't talk about liberals and conservatives, Republicans or Democrats, I just talk history, culture, and language, so you are going beyond my scope. So Metatron's defense for constantly attacking what he calls woke revisionism while uncovering what goes on in American schools is not because he leans right, but because Netflix is in his face and American politics are outside the scope of his channel. But personally, I think that's bullshit. As Metatron said in his last video, he will actually talk about politics if it happens to overlap with the topics he covers on his channel.
So I don't talk about political leaders or who to vote or what political party to support, but I do attack arguments when they overlap and they are invading another subject, such as literature, linguistics, culture, and what have you. It's politics that is in my field, not the other way around. I'm in my natural habitat here.
And when the things going on in American schools were brought up to Metatron's attention, the commenter in this context wasn't asking Metatron to talk about the Republicans or the Democrats. He was asking Metatron to talk about the negationism that is happening in schools. Metatron could, in fact, address the negationism in American schools without going outside his scope, because if negationism is within the scope, then these examples definitely are as well. However, to be fair and completely transparent, this exchange did happen after the release of Metatron's video on revisionism. Therefore, it is genuinely possible that Metatron did not know about these examples when making his video. But to also be fair, this was before Metatron's video on the failure of the education system towards children. That would have been a very good time to address these things, now that he's been made aware of them. So, did he? Of course not. Instead, he brought up a 5-year-old cartoon from BBC, which has already been defended by academics, by the way. He brought up unnamed, unspecified articles he found online, which would not be shown to children in any case, and he brought up a single publishing house doctoring their books, the same one he was referring to in the last part of his revisionism video. Which again, the books themselves are not integral to education. So what's going on? Why is Metatron avoiding talking about this? Well, the only indication I could find is how he frames his revisionism video at the very beginning.
We'll also see how real historical facts are being changed in the present. How historical truth is under a systematic extensive attack fueled by corporate money, which is permeating both the educational and edutainment infrastructure, particularly in Western society within the Anglosphere.
So tell me then, if American politics are outside the scope, but talking about historical revisionism is not, what does Western society within the Anglosphere stand for exactly? What it is a euphemism. It's a made-up term that allows him to talk about America without explicitly talking about America. It's a term that allows him to come into America to cherry-pick examples of wokeism, but then he can ignore everything that the right is doing. It's very convenient. And now you might say, well, maybe it really is beyond his scope, like the culture war and everything. Okay, but we're not talking about politics here, right? We're talking about negationism. And that's what's happening in the States right now. If you want real examples, as I've said, there are plenty. And let's be clear here. The real danger is right there. Politicians using their power to censor books, to remove things from curriculums that don't fit their narrative. And right off the bat, like, you can still bring more examples. In his review of The Woman King, Metatron cited a PragerU pundit. But the first thing you see on their website constantly is they are not an actual university. Didn't stop Florida from hiring them to implement programs in their schools, even though they are not an actual university. This is all happening right now. And by using sentences like Western society within the Anglosphere, Metatron is purposefully avoiding to talk about all of that while still spewing all of his conservative talking points. This is what's happening. Now, I can only speculate as to why Metatron is jumping through so many hoops to specifically avoid talking about those things when he himself says that he only cares about the historical truth. But my only guess is that a lot of his conservative audience probably agrees with all of that shit. And if he decided to actually be objective and actually talk about those things, he would actually end up turning a lot of them against him, and that's just not good for business. Again, don't take my word for that, it's just a guess. So instead, Metatron will always do the same thing, which is start a video with like a small tiny disclaimer at the beginning, just to say that whitewashing is bad too or something, before moving on to conveniently only spew conservative talking points. He'll talk about wokeness, he'll talk about cancel culture, he'll talk about forced diversity, and if anyone calls him out on that, he'll just take a step back and be like, well, I don't really talk about that stuff because it's beyond my scope, but also, I said at the beginning that Genghis Khan played by a white actor is bad too, so you can't say I'm biased here. Honestly, it's weak. It's really weak. And to be clear, I'm aware of who I am. I am a leftist, and I do have a low opinion of conservatism. But that's not something I just reach by default. I substantiate my arguments. Metatron could very well be a conservative, and we could disagree on pretty much everything. That would be fine. But his research is just bad, and he barely ever brings any sources to back up his claims, and when he does, he often misinterprets them, and that all stems from a conservative bias. Hey guys, I'm not wearing the same shirt, my hair is longer, it's because it's a reshoot. In my original script, this was the part in my video where I said that if Metatron wanted to disprove these claims of having a conservative bias, he could simply make dedicated videos to attack the negationism coming from the right. But this is where we come back to one of Metatron's latest video that he released last week. Is this channel political? Because if there's one thing that Metatron finally got around to doing with this video, it's discussing his political beliefs. Well, kind of.
I consider myself to be a right-leaning moderate, also known as a moderate conservative.
In this video, Metatron comes out as a right-leaning moderate, which in of itself could be an admission that his videos can also lean to the right, but that's not what it is. Despite this admission, he still spends a good chunk of the video arguing that, while no one is free from personal bias, his videos nonetheless aim for the objective truth, to stick to the facts.
I do of course have my own personal political preferences, which I do always try to keep on hold whenever approaching any subject matter on this channel. And I do that in order to try to be as intellectually honest as possible in any given analysis. So, as a channel, the only position I claim here is evidence-based factual neutrality, filtered through the competence dimension. As a criterion or theoretical point of departure, it encompasses epistemological, empirical, and ontologically confirmed reality.
But tell me then, what was objective about any of these videos? They all clearly have a right-leaning bias. This isn't like, whoopsie, my bias got in the way. This is very intentional. But what's more frustrating about this video is that while Metatron says it's the only video he'll ever make talking about his political beliefs, he does not substantiate any of them. In one moment, he'll say he leans to the right because of the way he was brought up, with traditional values like marriage and family.
I think that the fact that I tend to be right-leaning more often than not has to do with my upbringing. I was brought up with traditional values, I believe in the traditional family.
But then he'll follow it up by vaguely associating with ideologies like liberal conservatism and classical liberalism, but then he immediately dissociates himself from these labels because as a moderate, he does not associate with any clear labels.
And on certain items I tend to have points of agreement with two ideologies which in Europe are called liberal conservatism and classical liberalism. It gets really complicated, which is why I tend to ditch all of the nomenclature and consider myself I'm a moderate, but I'm not perfectly centric. I tend to be right-leaning.
But also, he believes some things from the past should be protected.
I also think that there is wisdom in some cultural achievements of our past which should be protected and maintained. In my mind, there are some traditional values that should be preserved.
But also, he believes in progressive change, but doesn't agree all change is progressive.
With that being said, it doesn't mean that I'm against any forms of progress per se. It's just that in my mind, that becomes a case-by-case scenario because I do believe that all progress is change, but I don't believe that all change is progress.
And then he will share some core values, like his belief in freedom of speech and the freedom for people to live their lives however they want, and how he will not impose his traditional values on other people.
I'm also a strong supporter of freedom of speech, I'm against censorship, and I'm against silencing. With that being said, on the same note, I also believe that every person has the right and freedom to live their life as they will. In fact, even though I tend to prefer more traditional values and a more traditional family for my life, that doesn't mean that I forcefully apply those precepts onto you. In fact, I think it is your right to make that choice, and I will fight for your freedom to be able to disagree with me without being afraid of standing for what you believe in.
So, in practical terms, what does any of this mean? Besides marriage and family, what are some ideas from the past that he thinks must be preserved and protected? What are some progressive ideas he's for? And what are some progressive ideas that he's against? If, for example, he believes in marriage, but is also fine with people living lives however they want. So is he pro-gay marriage? Is he fine with people transitioning? Is he fine with multiculturalism? To imply that people should have the freedom to live their lives however they want without his conservative values being enforced on them means that he wants equal rights for minorities, that he's pro-feminism. And these beliefs would not make him a right-leaning moderate. They would make him, at the very least, a social liberal. But can we know for sure? Well, no, because again, he's very careful not to take a single stance on any wedge issue. Now to be clear, I don't need Metatron to be on my side here. If he's a conservative, so be it. But I don't think the fact that he did not bring up a single political position in a video that is specifically about politics is coincidental. I think this is just another instance of Metatron being very careful with his wording. He's being very careful not to upset his conservative audience by taking a left-leaning position on any given issue. And ultimately, all the video does is re-emphasize all of the issues that I have with Metatron. Metatron ignores a lot of the main criticisms that have been made against him. At the end of the video, Metatron goes back to the criticism that he only ever addresses problems coming from the right as a small mention at the beginning of videos without actually making dedicated videos. And what does he do? He brings up the same video where he made a compilation of all the small mentions.
Now, even though I say this, I've seen people in the comments saying, well, yeah, you do mention whitewashing, but you don't have full-on dedicated videos about that, but you do have several videos dedicated to blackwashing. Isn't that inconsistent? And my answer to that is, even though I resent both, let's be honest about it.
And then he defends himself against the criticism, but only part of it. He only defends his lack of attention to whitewashing.
Yes, whitewashing was absolutely present in the 60s, in the 70s, but where is all of this whitewashing of historical characters right now?
Which, as has been demonstrated in this video, and as it has been brought up to him in the comments months ago, the attacks on history coming from the right do not come exclusively in the form of whitewashing. So yeah, it's actually very easy to defend against that because he is right. The blatantly racist whitewashing of the 70s just isn't as common anymore. But again, what about all the other ways in which the right is attacking history right now? How does he respond to that?
In my experience, we are much more exposed to both the blackwashing of historical characters and also a lot of other far-left positions right now in the media than we are to alt-right. In fact, to be honest, I never see anything from the alt-right. So I think that unless you go and specifically look for those kind of forums when they talk about, I don't know, the ancient Romans being all Nordic, which is nonsense. The problem is that when I open Netflix, all I see is blackwashing everywhere, which is why I focus on that. That is what I see, and therefore I react to what I'm exposed to.
It's the same argument he's made before. He criticizes Netflix because it's in his face, and he doesn't attack the right because it's not in his face. But that argument implies that he never goes out of his way to look for things to debunk that aren't already in his daily media consumption. But where does that leave his videos like The Truth About LGBT in Ancient Greece? I mentioned it in my previous video, but I ran an experiment just googling certain terms to see if I find the article, and even with the most specific words, I could not find the article. Am I supposed to believe Metatron just goes on LGBT websites all the time, and that one time the gay activist got in his face? Of course not! He was looking really hard to find an article to make a video about, and he could just as easily make an effort to find the things coming from the right. In the end, because Metatron systematically refuses to attack things coming from the right, even when examples are provided for him, because he is constantly pushing right-wing talking points into his videos and is refusing to acknowledge it, and because he is making an explicit effort not to take a single left-leaning position on anything, I'm compelled to believe that this video was disingenuous, as was this one, this one, and this one, and this one. But even after all of this, there's a part of me, maybe as a former fan or just as an optimist, that doesn't want to believe any of the things I've said in this video. To be clear, I do think Metatron is wrong on a lot of things, and he makes a lot of very bad points, but I don't want to believe that he does it on purpose. I don't want to believe that he would lie like that all the time. I don't want to believe that he would go so far to avoid topics just because they attack the right. And I would hope that this time, instead of just watching the video, Metatron actually responds, that he would respond to the criticisms and the things I highlighted. And despite everything, in the spirit of charitability, I will take 3 things from this video completely at his word.
Probably already know this, but I do not support this idea of my truth, her truth, their truth. I just believe there is one truth, and 2 mutually exclusive opposites cannot both be true at the same time. One is true, one is false. I'm always open to be corrected and to retract any statement that I've made publicly if new evidence is presented to me that seems to suggest that in fact I was incorrect in my previous assessment. And I'm happy to receive these corrections from either right-wingers, left-wingers, conservatives, liberals. It doesn't matter. Consequently, that is one of the reasons why I strongly believe that a civil debate is mutually beneficial for all parties involved. Hence, if you have different political positions to mine, I don't hate you for it. I don't shame you for it. I respect you and your freedom. And I would sit down and discuss in full recognition of your freedom and liberty in front of a coffee.
Listen, I would be about as new to live conversations as I am to these video essays, but I would actually love to have a conversation with Metatron. And if we start from his premise that there is only one objective truth, then I think there's a lot of objective truths we could establish together. For example, either he's right about the Woman King, or I am. Either he was censored by YouTube, or he wasn't. Diversity in movies is either negationism, or it's not. All this to say, there's a lot of things we could be talking about, and if he wants to have that conversation, Metatron only has to reach out. Anyway, thanks for watching everyone. I hope this video came up shorter than my previous one. After all, I only started this responding to one video. At the risk of seeming like I pay too much attention to the same YouTuber, let me say this is absolutely true. As I said in my very first video on him, because I was a gaming channel that was just starting to cover politics, it seemed fitting to respond to a history channel that was just starting to cover politics. And hopefully as I become better and better at making these videos, maybe I'll look into other YouTubers to use for practice. Just a final note on historical revisionism, guys. As I've said, part of understanding history is understanding that history will never be fully uncovered. With that in mind, I can make arguments on what Metatron is doing in his videos, and I can substantiate them all I want, but at the end of the day, I can't know what the guy is actually thinking. Just so there's no confusion, my video title, The Truth About Metatron Once and For All, should not be taken literally. What it is a satire of Metatron's latest content. That's all. Anyway, as with the previous video, feel free to argue with me in the comments if you disagree with my takes, just make sure you're not talking about something I didn't already address. And if you did actually agree with my takes, well, you know what? Feel free to subscribe for more. And hopefully, I will see you next time. Bye bye.